All right, welcome everyone to our June community call for NetBox. My name is Jeremy Strutch. With me today is Jordan Villarreal. Today we are going to be going through some updates on just what's been going on in the last 30 days or so since our last call for NetBox. We're going to touch on our 6-year anniversary, which is actually coming up on Monday. We were at Cisco Live it was just last week. Gosh,
Yeah.
so some interesting notes from that. We'll be showcasing a community project called Business Ready and NetBox Giftwrap by John Capobianco. Um, I'll run through some of the upcoming 3.3 features, and we'll close out with some community questions and answers. So let's go ahead and get into it. Yeah, so first off, NetBox turns 6 on Monday. June 27th, 2016 was our version 1.0 release. Kind of hard to believe. It's been 6 years. And in the interim, we've seen about 223 releases from over 200 individual contributors. So that is very, very cool. On the graph here, you can see we're tracking GitHub star count because we don't really have a way to directly track community deployments or anything like that because it's open source. But as you can see, the project shows absolutely no sign of slowing down. If anything, it may have actually increased the rate of growth in the last year or so. So interesting to see that continue to spike upward. Next up, so Jordan and I were both at Cisco Live, which was a lot of fun. That was in Las Vegas last week. Um, Obviously, pretty good turnout at the conference, right? Did we ever figure out how many people were there?
I still never heard a firm answer. I know it was over 10,000 people. It was definitely less than 20,000 people. I heard 12. I heard 14.
Yeah,
I'm going to put it right in the middle and say it was 15,000.
that sounds about right. It definitely looked like a lot, which was cool to see post. I don't know if I want to even say post COVID, but
Yeah.
the first time holding it in person again for I think they skipped the previous two conferences.
Yeah. The last
U.S.
two,
anyway.
the first one was a bit of a scramble. The second one during COVID or just the outbreak, they had it a little bit more refined. There were classes available and everything, so it was a better representation. But this year was true to form. It was the original Cisco Live from 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's very cool. I want to say thank you to everyone who stopped by and said, "Hey, we were hanging out at the NS1 booth for a lot of the conference." It's very cool to see NetBox represented so widely in the community, and especially in the talks. It turns out. So I know we actually covered this, I think, in our previous call. We were aware of a couple talks at Cisco Live that were going to be featuring NetBox, not featuring, but involving NetBox as part of the content. So we hooked up with Palmer Sample, who had a couple of those. He had two different presentations, three sessions, because one of them was duplicated because it was in such high demand, which is an awesome signal to be seeing. Um, and so we hung out by a couple of his talks. After talking with him, he asked if we could be around just to handle any netbox questions that happened to pop up after the talk. So we said sure, that sounds great. And while we're hanging out there in the little devnet area, if you're not familiar, so the devnet area this year at least was basically one corner off by registration. They had a bunch of these different, you can kind of see in the pictures, different little booths set up, so little workshops, and then behind that there were a couple of different presentations that were going on. So I think there were like 7 or 8 areas within DevNet. But what was great about it is you could just walk through and see everything that's going on and listen to the presenters. Unlike the breakout sessions where they were all behind closed doors and everything, the DevNet area is very, very wide open. So in walking around, we kept seeing NetBox pop up on all these screens everywhere.
Yep.
There's a couple of pictures there you can see where it played a pretty central role in a lot of these presentations, which is just phenomenal.
Yeah, it was it was interesting because that picture there in the center with the green boxes, that's Palmer, and we were standing off to the side. And then I don't remember if you tapped on my shoulder or if I tapped on your shoulder, but that picture in the upper right-hand corner is like, "Oh, look, there's Netbox over there too." So it was really cool to be there and just see the uptake of Netbox being in presentations. completely unprompted. Is if we hadn't found out about Palmer through Twitter that he was doing his, I don't know that we would have specifically known. And then just being there, seeing the other ones pop up, it was really cool.
Yeah, it's very, very encouraging to see continue being used and being promoted by Cisco, of all companies.
Indeed.
So very, very cool stuff. I know that we're at NS1 we're exploring partner relationships with different vendors now, and I think this will go a long way to help bolstering that initiative. Um, but yeah, we'll see how that. We'll probably have some more to share on that in the toward the second half of the year.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Cool. So next is a community showcase. I'll let Jordan take this one. Very, very cool tool that's come out recently.
Yeah, so this was made by John Capiabanco. And John, for people out there studying network automation or just trying to get into network automation, there's a good chance that you've come across either his book or his website or a blog or just a conversation with John directly. He's a very, very large figure in the automation scene, that's figuratively and literally. He is a tall gentleman. Um, so he has this. He used to work for one of the governments in Canada, but now he actually works for Cisco as a automation or a programmer advocate. So that's part of John's job, is to sort of help educate the world. So something that he has put together, he calls Business Ready, and it's these series of different plugins that allow you to directly query equipment and extract information and have it in a business ready format, which really just gives you an opportunity to edit the data a little bit more. I don't want to say naturally, but more in your own tool set so that you can come up with different reports that you can present to people. And he recently wrote an extension off of that he called Giftwrap, which is for NetBox. So it's this Python-based tool, and essentially you will launch it at your environment, and it's going to give you the ability to extract from 67 different sources behind the scenes in NetBox. So if you just think about racks or circuits or any of the major categories in there, you can go a little bit deeper. So when you think about circuits, well, he can also pull out just circuit types or circuit providers. So it doesn't adhere to each API directly. So it's not just going to dump all the circuit. Well, it can just dump all the circuit data, but you can also get a little granular in there. And the cool bit about it is that it'll output in 7 different formats, which includes MP3, which I'll touch on before we hit the next slide. But essentially, if you were interacting with the API, you'd be getting a JSON output anyway. But you can also get outputs in YAML, HTML, comma separated, Markdown, in a mind map format in addition to MP3. And the idea here is to allow end users to more readily manipulate that data in a way that's easier to present without having to be too plugged into a programmatic process. So yeah, you still have to know how to launch a Python script, and you have to know how to edit the data afterwards. But to me, that's where the HTML and the comma separated formats really shine, because HTML you can send to someone else and they can look at. But the comma separated, to me, that's where the best value is, because you can just take that same data, drop it in Excel database, an Excel spreadsheet, and then manipulate it however you need to for whatever presentation you need to give for it. If it's giving it to a boss, if it's giving it to another technician, if it's giving it to somebody in a data center to verify a bunch of cabled connections, you can sort of put that data in a way that makes sense without having to write a custom report through the existing reporting engine inside of NetBox. So it's a really cool plugin. And if we skip to the next slide, I kicked off a process here running against the public demo, and it's relatively straightforward in terms of how you execute it. So you launch the Python script, you give the URL that you're going against. You give the token for the API access, and then you say what API do you want to query. And I just picked Rex. And you can see as it's stepping through there, there's the JSON, and I told it to put it in all formats. So there's the JSON, the YAML, the HTML, the Markdown, the comma separated, and then all of the mind map files are individual ones. So those can be a little cumbersome to handle if you have all of those. But again, it just dumps it all right out. And I don't have a screenshot of what the output looks like because that comma separated file, you need one of those ultra wide monitors to fit it all in one page. And trying to put that in here just wasn't going to do it justice. But it's a really cool tool. John did a great job with it. There are other plugins available, so it's not just NetBox. He's got ones that'll query iOS. Cisco iOS XE devices directly. I think he might have some Juniper ones in there, but it's a fun way to pull data out and allow you to manipulate it without having to become the programming wizard, at least that John is.
Very cool. Yeah, and if you get all that CSV data, it's a lot obviously for a screenshot, but what's great about that is you have all of that data readily accessible in CSV, so you load that in a spreadsheet or tool of your choice, and I've had complete flexibility to manipulate all that data.
Yeah, it is really unique the way that it displays it. He even has the direct URLs in there. So if you're referencing a specific cable or a device or a rack within that data that he outputs, there's the full URL straight to it. So if whatever you're putting in there is an electronic handoff to someone else, they can click through and see exactly what you're referencing. So he put a lot of effort and a lot of thought into making sure that it went together. And one sort of aside, and this was a nice thing to hear from somebody who works with a lot of APIs, is that John was very complimentary of the NetBox API in general, just in terms of how easy it was for him to understand and interface starting from ground level. So for anyone who is looking to play more with the API on their own, from what I'm told from an industry expert, it's we have one of the better APIs available out there. So it's good
Very
stuff.
cool. That's good feedback. That's very encouraging to hear.
Yep, absolutely.
APIs can be tricky. Yeah, there's some terrible ones too I've seen where it's just like objects within objects within objects, and you're you kind of get lost in the fluff there.
Yeah, thankfully that's not NetBox.
No. All right, cool. Thanks for sharing that, Jordan. Next up, we've got some upcoming features in 3.3. So we're getting to that time of the year where it's approaching, about time for 3.3 beta. We should have that out here sometime in the middle of next month, probably. So a couple more weeks. Some major features coming in that are, first off, issue number 51. So earlier we talked about how NetBox is turning 6. Issue number 51 is also almost 6. I think that was opened the same day as our version 1.0 release, and that was a feature request to model half-height rack units. So if you have a equipment rack and you have some devices that only take up half of the vertical height in a rack, because they're very thin, you actually model 2 devices in a rack. Or if you have, I don't know how common this is anymore. It used to be more common, like with some of the older Catalyst switches, there would actually be 1.5 rack units high. So you would fit 2 devices in 3 rack units together. Not a very efficient use of rack space, obviously, but it was a thing before things got smaller. But that's finally done. We actually have that implemented now. You can have half-height rack units, 1.5 height, 1.5 U rack units, or whatever you choose to do. And model those, and everything is rendered in SVG as it is today. So that is all finally there 6 years later. Next up was multi-termination cable endpoints. This is probably the meat of this release. So for a long time, a point of contention with modeling the physical cabling topology is how to break out like simplex fiber strands. So the canonical example is you have a fiber pair going from an SFP into 2 individual ports on a patch panel, typically like LC or SC ports. So ports like 1 and 2 would be strands A and B in the fiber, but on the other end, it's going to a single interface. So up till now, NetBox had no great way to do that. You kind of had to pretend that the two ports on the panel were one. So now we can actually model that correctly. So we've got support for multiple terminations on either end of a cable. Sounds simple. Turns out it's a lot of work to implement that to actually overhaul the cabling model. But I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. We'll see if that's true of other people as well once we actually go through the beta. But please, 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 if that's something that's interesting to you, definitely try out the beta. Let us know what you think. It seems like it satisfies most use cases. There's still some open questions around, I think, like breakout cables, because those get kind of tricky. So it's not, I won't say it's settled once and for all, but it's certainly an improvement over what exists today. Beyond that, toggling custom field availability, or excuse me, visibility. That was a big one. I know that it's come up a number of times. People have asked about, like, how do I hide custom fields from for certain objects and under certain conditions. What we found is a lot of people in the community are leveraging custom fields for automation tasks. So things that are interesting to API consumers, but not so much human users. So what we decided to do with this is we have three different choices now for custom field visibility. There's the default, which exists today, which is just you're always going to show it and be able to edit it through the UI. But now you also have the option to either hide it in the UI or just make it read-only. So this is great for if you've got certain custom fields that are being updated by monitoring tools or what have you, just to cache that data in NetBox. But you don't ever want a user to actually modify it or potentially even see it. Now you can do that, so it makes it a little bit more, we'll say, user-friendly, or improves the UX a bit. So especially if you have a bunch of these fields, now it's not going to take up space on the screen. Actually, following that, we also have the ability to group custom fields now, which is also pretty nice. So if you have a number of custom fields that are interdependent or related to one another, you can group them and they'll show up in their own little panel on the UI. So that's always helpful. Multiple NATs per IP. This is another one of our really old issues. It was open for a long time, I think, because we were kind of stagnated on how to address or whether to address port address translation. Probably shouldn't have used the word address there so many times, but you've got the layer 4 port address translation as one concept. That's not this issue. We may still undertake that in future work. This is to have multiple NAT records pointing to a single IP internally. So that's done now. Another one of our older issues is PoE attributes for interfaces. This has been open for a long time, again, because we've kind of got stuck in figuring out, well, how much of this are we going to model? Are we going as far as power budget? What other types are out there that we might need to model? What we settled on for this, just to get it implemented and so we can move along with it, is we're adding two new attributes to the interface model. So one is PoE mode. That's going to be either power supplying equipment, power device, or none. And then PoE type. And the types that we've added so far are the 4 current IEEE standards, types 1 through 4, the different 802.3 standards. And then we've also added some of the passive types. So that is 24 or 48 volts across 2 or 4 pairs. So 4 options there as well. And there's probably more that we need to add. There's a bunch of really strange like proprietary PoE implementations for whatever reason. I joked the other day, I tweeted out that, like, I spent 10 minutes reading about them and now I'm just in a bad mood because there's so much like kind of random stuff out there. And the worst, it's not that it all exists, it's that you might have the same standard, like say 2 devices have 24 volt across 2 pair, but each vendor calls it something different. And it's trying to capture that and like make it evident to the user that no, this is really the same thing. That becomes very challenging. So standard's good. That's all I'll say about that. And the last one we had on here is a really cool, somewhat later addition to this, was the ability to restrict API tokens by source IP address. So as you likely know, the NetBox API utilizes tokens for authentication. This extends that so that now you can limit a token to being valid only when used by a specific source IP or by a range of or by a specific IP network. So this was Samuel L. on GitHub did a lot of great work for that. We've got that implemented now. So that's very cool to help lock down the API. This is great for if you're issuing tokens to specific automation tools. And like, for example, if you know that this token should only ever be used by an Ansible host, and there's only one Ansible host out there that's ever going to use it, it makes sense to lock it down by IP address just as an added layer of security. There is one other thing on here that I know a lot of people are excited about. I didn't add it to the list because Dan Shepard is currently working on it, and that is EVPN or layer 2 VPN support for NetBox. I didn't add it to the list because I haven't synced up yet with Dan. We have a meeting next week, I think, to go over the final 3.3 stuff. But I didn't add it to the list because I didn't want to commit on behalf of Dan, have him committed to any work, because I don't know the current status of it. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get that in the beta or not. I'm hopeful that we will, but keep an eye on that. I forget the issue offhand, but it is tagged as a milestone on the GitHub issues. So we will we'll check on that. I still need to finish up some stuff for cabling, and there's a few other open milestones, more minor things to check on. We did lose a couple. We bumped a couple early on from this. There's not quite as much going into this release as we had hoped, but that all comes down to primarily how long it took me to get the cabling model up and running. That was quite an endeavor, but still a lot of great stuff on this release. And of course, anything that doesn't make it in 3.3, there's always 3.4.
I'm personally looking forward to that cabling update. Cabling has changed so much. We're going back to the breakout cables and like the squid cables that used to be around. I'm thinking back to the serial days and seeing more of that in the fiber world now than ever before. So it's really great. I love that.
It is funny how it's iterative, isn't it? I remember there was a module on the old Catalyst 6500, might have been the 6000, where the module just had 4 Amphenol connectors on the front of it, and they were each 25 pair connectors that would fan out to what is it, some number like 12 or I think 12 individual 100 meg Cat 5 connections. Like just insane octopus cables that were like totally out of spec, obviously, but it was 100 meg Cat 5, so whatever.
Right. Yeah, and there was tons of that in the phone world as well, just breaking out the trunk lines into individual lines. It is funny to see old tech or old approaches become new again.
I hope no one has to model those anymore.
Well, I know where they can do it.
Yeah, right. All right. So we'll move on to the community Q&A. We've got about 8 or so minutes left. So we had 4 questions come in for this. First one's from Peter. NetBox still has a very, quote unquote, basic UI. It represents the database, shows tables, creates flat forms, etc. Will there be an effort to make this less database and more UIX? I mean, it's kind of a generic question. We're always looking at ways to improve the UI for sure. I would argue that having it be database-esque or table focused is not a bad thing. I mean, that's why so many people go to spreadsheets, right? It's just a very natural way to arrange data along 2 dimensions. That said, obviously the UI can always stand to be improved. That's probably true of any application. We did a major overhaul, obviously led by fellow maintainer Matt Love back for 3.0, which is great. But of course, I mean, even Matt will tell you, like, he's not a designer by trade. None of us are. So one thing I'm actually looking into soon here, thanks to NS1 having its weight behind the project now, is bringing in perhaps a contract design person, like an actual professional designer, to come in and help us clean up and improve the UI. So that some output of that work might speak to this point a little bit. But that said, if you have any specific recommendations or suggestions for the UI, put in a feature request. Worst case, we'll just say, "No, we can't really swing it." Given that we're limited in our resources currently for what we can do in the UI. But if it's a simple, if it's a thing about layout or like simple styling, we certainly dig into it. Next question is from James. So he asks, is there a published long-term roadmap of NetBox anywhere? There isn't a long-term roadmap. We kind of do release to release. So we've covered this in previous calls, but our release cadence currently is every 4 months. So we'll do a release in April and August and then in December. So obviously the 3.3 release is coming up now in August, and 3.4 should be December. And that will continue until we obviously bump to 4.0 at some point in the future. Um, the reason we don't have a long-term roadmap is because working in open source is a lot different than a commercial product. When you're developing a commercial product, you have the luxury of a roadmap because you have the ability to know, to some degree at least, how much development effort you can commit to a project, because you'll know how many people you're budgeted for on staff, and roughly what their output will be, and so forth and so on. With open source, it's a lot more, we'll say, chaotic. And that, I mean, even if we go back to the 3.3 milestones, you'll notice that there is a wide, if you look at the issue numbers here, there is obviously a wide variance for how long each of these issues was open, right? The first one on here has been open for 6 years. The one directly after that was more recent. It had been an ongoing one, obviously, but then custom field visibility, that was only probably a month or two old. So there's a big deviation in what goes on the roadmap, and how we determine that is not a fixed function, but it has several inputs. So one of them is demand for it. Obviously, that's the primary driver. How many people want to use it? If no one wants it, we're not going to do it. Two is difficulty or complexity involved, which typical software engineering stuff. Three is we have to make sure that it's not going to preclude us from doing something else in the future. And that's typically a concern around data modeling. So, for example, I mentioned the NAT IP address thing, the multiple NATs. Right, we didn't want to make any progress on that until we were sure that wasn't going to block us from doing something with like layer 4 address translation in the future, or maybe if not blocking us, then at least making it a much more difficult task. So that's all kind of just an open conversation, and we always have so many moving pieces, and just making sure that we're staying out of each other's way in that regard. So that's 3 factors, and the fourth is is someone willing to work on it. That's a major factor in open source work, right? The features that people are willing to commit time and effort to are the ones that are going to make it into the product. I and the other maintainers, we pick up what we can, obviously. I work on a ton of stuff I don't use personally, of course, just to keep the project going. But the more people we have working on it, the more we can do that. And we kind of try to roadmap a little bit, but ultimately it will change over time, right? The thing is, if we plan out the next 3 releases, and then someone says, "Oh, but here's feature X," and everyone says, "Hey, this is a great idea," and someone says, "Yeah, I'll work on it," we're not going to say, "No, sorry, we have to wait for another 9 months until a slot on the roadmap opens up." We're going to say, "That's great. Let's try to get this in," so long as it doesn't preclude other work. So it's always kind of a moving target. Sorry if that was kind of a long-winded answer to that question. There was a question in the chat about will multiple endpoints be rendered in the SVG output? Will it work with the current one rear to end front port approach? Yes, they are rendered in the SVG output. That's still somewhat of a work in progress, trying to make everything fit correctly, specifically the text labels. But yeah, they'll be rendered there. We're still doing the front port to rear port mapping. That's all still supported. I'll put a big asterisk on that, saying I don't know how well this will all work. As I mentioned, it hasn't been merged yet. Preliminary testing is all very, very encouraging. But as we found in the past, there's a lot more complexity to cabling than appears on the surface. So more testing is needed, and that'll be a big part of what we do in the beta, I think. Okay, we had 2 more questions. The next one was, again, by Peter. What is the link between NS1 and NetBox? Is NS1 simply a sponsor of NetBox, and NetBox remains a community project? Or does NS1, quote unquote, own NetBox now? So we kind of see this question a lot. I think it stems from confusion in general about how open source works. So to be clear, NetBox is a project released under the Apache 2 license. No one owns it. The way the Apache 2 license and most open source licenses work is everyone who contributes to it does so by granting rights to their work under the same license. So every time you push a commit to it, that commit is the code that's being submitted. It falls under the terms of the Apache 2 license, which says basically anyone can go and do whatever they want with it, with a few minor conditions. That's true for NS1. It's true for anyone else on the planet. The relationship between NS1 and NetBox is that NS1 is its primary sponsor, right? And that is primarily through my full-time employment, through Jordan's full-time employment, and through funding for other initiatives as they come up. As I mentioned, potentially looking hiring a design person to help with the UI and things like that. So NS1 provides something you may have heard of called NetBox Cloud, which is simply a SaaS offering of the open source NetBox project, hosted and managed by NS1, bundled with support and professional services and all that. It's not a fork or anything like that. Same exact product, with some additional wrapping around it to make it more cloud friendly. Meaning, what would normally require in an on-premises deployment would require you to SSH into the box and like change some file and do that. We have a UI for that on the cloud side, as you'd expect. No one should be SSHing ideally into their cloud application. But that's where it stands right now. Hopefully that's pretty clear. I'll just reiterate that from day one, even before day one, NS1 has been incredibly supportive of the project and fully aware and cautious of doing anything that would disrupt the open nature of the community. So hopefully that alleviates any concerns. Anything to add on that, Jordan? You have any take on that?
No, not really. I think you hit that pretty much square on. I definitely enjoy the sponsorship relationship. I think that's a good way to talk about it. It's definitely over time going to enable the project to be a little bit more nimble and respond to community requests and just new features. So it's been great so far. I can't speak any more highly of it.
Yeah, I mean, I joined NS1 in April of last year, and the amount of work I've been able to do on the project just in the past year has far or surpassed anything I've been able to attain in the previous 5 years working on NetBox. Okay, last question real quick. Would you consider adding a generic auto-incrementing integer, which we can simply reserve the next free value from, and query to see if a certain value is used? Then we could use it for whatever we need. I'm not sure of the exact context of this question. It sounds like James is asking for a custom field type that auto increments, which sounds really cool. As far as technical feasibility, probably. My concern, as with most things, is around efficiency and optimization. How can we do that reliably? Because typically, if you're unaware, when you go to create a new object in NetBox, it gets a numeric primary key. Every object has this ID field that serves as a primary key in the database, and that is derived from a sequence in PostgreSQL. So that's actually handled by the database itself. So if this is for custom fields, we'd have to figure out, are we like actually creating a sequence in the database, or is that something that we're handling at the application layer? So that would need to be figured out. And if it's not for custom fields, I apologize, because I probably just haven't grasped the correct context for which this is used. But I will say this, put in a feature request and make sure, as with any feature request, two critical components are, fully detail the proposed implementation. What is it? How should it work? And just as important, your use case, right? Why do you want this? How do you intend to use it? Because that will inform the design just as well as the actual proposed implementation. Cool. So I look forward to seeing that, discussing that more. Sounds like it could be a potentially cool feature. Okay, that is it for us. We're just a couple minutes over. So thanks everyone who stuck around. I appreciate that. Jordan, any last words?
Yeah, just I have a quick question for the community. Since we had so much fun at Cisco Live, if anyone out there has any recommendations for conferences, user group meetups that you're a part of, that you would like to see us at, shake a hand, get a NetBox sticker. We have those now. Please drop us a line on Twitter, in the chat here, anywhere that you can find us, because we're looking for other places to have these conversations, not just at that high ticket priced Cisco Live event.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Yeah. Hit us up on Twitter or in the NetDev Slack and let us know. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for your time. And until next time, thank you.